welcome. Thank you all for coming in such huge numbers. We're very happy to see you all here. So my name is Badama Petek. I work at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research of the USC Shaw Foundation. And today I'm delighted to introduce you to Danielle Willard-Kyle, our 2018-2019 Center Graduate Research Fellow. So Danielle is a PhD candidate in history at Rutgers University, specializing in modern Europe with a minor in women and gender. She holds a BA in history from Westmont College, MA in history and Jewish studies from the University of Toronto, and Master of Studies in Jewish Studies from Oxford University. Her research focuses on the intersection of post-war testimonies from European and North African Jewish refugees, and in the ways this research can connect to current events in immigration. She has received numerous fellowships and awards, including 2017 Ben and Zelda Cohen Visiting Fellowship at the United States Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., 2015 Mellon Summer Research Grant, 2014 to 2019 Special Doctoral Fellowship from the Steven Spielberg Endowment for Jewish Studies and the Memory of the Shoah, and the 2013 and 2014 Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies Fellowship. She has presented her research at conferences and workshops at home and abroad, including more recently the 17th World Congress of Jewish Studies conference. She is also proficient in Yiddish, Italian, Spanish, and French. So please join me in welcoming Danielle. And also before she starts, let me just tell you that next week on Tuesday we have another lecture at noon by our other fellow, Bike van Kamp. So please be free to join us for that lecture as well. Thank you, and please, Danielle.
Thank you, Badama. I want to first start by saying thank you to the USC Shoah Foundation, and especially to the Center for Advanced Genocide Research for this fellowship. It's been a wonderful, wonderful 5 weeks, 4.5. I'm sad to go, and not just because I'm going back to New Jersey, which is cold and not as warm and sunny as it is here. Thank you to Wolf, to Martha, to Badema, and to Isabella for many great conversations and for all your technological and technical help. So Afterlives, Memories of the Displaced Persons Camps in Italy. I met Sydney Zoltak last year in a small town in northern Italy at a presentation for a book that had just come out about experiences, including his own, in Italian displaced persons camps. I watched as this 86-year-old, Polish-born, now Canadian resident spent the evening conversing with archivists, librarians, scholars, and locals, and presenting his own personal story, all in beautiful Italian. He told me that the day before he had attended a soccer match of the local team, the Cremonese. His team, he said, beaming with pleasure, where he was presented with his own jersey. He recalled, quote, "In Cremona, the people welcomed us with warmth. In the camp, I was reborn. I restarted my studies, played sports, and followed the Cremonese," which, incidentally, he continues to do to this day, ordering the Italian newspaper to his home in Montreal. He only lived in Italy for about 4 years, but his time there made such a deep impression on him that he continues his connections to this day. Zoltak, along with about 50,000 other foreign Jewish refugees, called Italy home for a time after the Second World War. My dissertation examines the daily life of these individuals in refugee displaced persons, or DP, camps from 1943 to 1951. Most immediately, my dissertation reorients the historiography on displaced persons by placing Italy at the center, arguing that, however temporarily, the Italian DP camps witnessed the creation of communities that learned to live in liminal spaces. Today's lecture comes out of my final chapter, which is entitled Afterlives, Memories of the Displaced Persons Camps in Italy. And it tracks the remembrance of the camps over time, both as spaces in personal memory and as physical places still today. It will look first at the issue of personal memory, contrasting immediate post-war testimonies and narratives with more recent testimonies that have been gathered in the last approximately 30 years. Within these more recent sources, the DP camps are often discussed as places of contentment, where refugees felt well treated. These statements, however, appear at odds with documents written by refugees while living in the camps, which often describe spaces of scarcity and displeasure. Through its examination of 3 themes, this lecture explores moments of contrast between past and present narratives, questioning the roles of memory and nostalgia in describing one's own experiences and conveying these to a broader audience. The talk will then turn to how these narratives are displayed materially today using 3 case studies of physical former campsites in Italy. It will show how former Jewish refugees and local Italians have maintained and forgotten the memories these crumbling structures hold. But first, let me just give a bit of general background. So during the Second World War, Italy started on the side of the Axis powers but capitulated in 1943. At this point, the Allies controlled the southern half while the Nazis and fascists controlled the north. You can see the line there. Racial laws and internment camps had been in place in Italy since 1938, but deportations only began after 1943. Roughly 20% of the Italian Jewish population was killed. At the end of World War II, the makeup of the Jewish population in Italy changed dramatically. Over the course of the 1945 summer alone, the so-called old refugees, that is, foreign Jews who had arrived in Italy before and during the war and were subsequently interned during that time, were joined by about 13,000 to 15,000 non-Italian Jewish DPs who entered the country, primarily over the Alps. These new refugees came primarily from Eastern and Central Europe, fleeing the continued anti-Semitism of their home countries and the dismal conditions of the DP camps in Austria and Germany. Bricha, Hebrew for escape or flight, was the organized movement of Jews from Eastern Europe to Palestine. And Bricha was organized by surviving partisans in Vilna, and it helped lead groups funded by the JDC and others to travel, often illegally, from Poland through the US occupied zone of Germany, then on to Palestine, using Italy as a point of departure. Once refugees reached the Italian border, Bricha guides, often working with Italian soldiers, helped facilitate their entry into the country. Still under the control of the Allied Commission, Italian authorities worked in tandem with the British, but mostly ignored the British call to tighten the borders against illegal immigration. Jewish immigration in particular was most concerning to the British. These immigrants were typically only trying to pass through Italy on their way to mandatory Palestine, but the British had closed off nearly all immigration to Palestine following the White Paper of 1939. Attempting to curry favor in the international community for humanitarian actions, the Italians felt they could not close the northern borders, as it would appear to be an anti-Jewish policy. Without the Italian help, the British were largely unsuccessful in closing the borders for those entering the country over the Alps. But by the end of 1945, they had nearly blockaded all the sea routes to Palestine, and the DPs were stuck. Between 1948 and 1950, a small minority of Jewish refugees, estimated at around 2,000 individuals, also traveled to Italy from North Africa, seeking asylum and passage on their way to Palestine. They were primarily Libyan Jews fleeing persecution in their homeland, particularly after the pogroms of 1945 and 1948. This group actually is not part of my lecture today, but I'm happy to speak about them in the Q&A if there are any questions, because they're very important to my dissertation. In total, nearly 50,000 Jewish refugees entered Italy between the summer of 1945 and the end of 1951. The majority wanted to immigrate to Israel, and by the end of 1949, nearly all the Jewish DPs had left Italy. The final refugee camp closed in 1951. However, for the intervening years, tens of thousands remained in Italy, unsure of their futures. Once in the country, refugees could enter transit camps, grouped largely in 2 categories, Hakshorot and displaced person camps. In total, there were 35 displaced person camps and 45 Hakshorot in Italy from 1945 to 51, although not all were active this whole time and their sizes varied greatly. The Hakshorot were started primarily by the Jewish Brigade for Palestine, and these were Zionist training camps where Jews could learn the skills deemed necessary to live in Palestine, most notably farming and Hebrew language. Compared to the Hakshorot, the DP camps were conceived on a much broader scale by the Allied forces. The Allied forces were responsible for the initial setup of the camps in Italy, but largely left the supplying and the running of the camps to 3 main groups, and I'll reference some of these throughout the talk. But here they are: the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, or UNRWA, and its later successor, the International Refugee Organization, or IRO. They were responsible for registration, repatriation, and later resettlement of Jewish refugees. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC, who funded many operations in and out of the camps, and the Jewish Agency, who worked in the Hakshorot, as I mentioned before, and whose main role was to get people to Palestine. A democratically elected group of refugees, however, governed the day-to-day events of the camps. So this is where we are then, as we turn to look at the question of memory. So documents from the early years of the DP camps can be found in many places. Most particularly, we find notes about DP life in camp newspapers,
for instance, Baderek, which is On the Way, a Zionist newspaper, and gathered testimonies in letters written by DPs to relatives or organizations, in diaries and in official paperwork. Many of these sources were gathered in 1952, right after the DP camps closed, as representatives from the Jiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institut, or the Yiddish Scientific Institute, the YIVO, traveled to Italy and gathered as many documents as possible, literally just scooped them all up, from the DP camps and brought them back here to New York. This cache of documents, primarily written in Yiddish, represents the largest collection of sources from refugees themselves during this period in Italy. Since the 1980s, a great many memoirs have been written and oral testimonies given by Holocaust survivors, as I'm sure we're all aware. Most of these center around wartime experiences, but many also include the immediate post-war period in their narratives. These also give us insight into what the immediate post-war period, what was important to survivors today, apologies. As historian Tony Kushner writes, quote, how a person puts together their life experiences in a coherent way tells us as much about their life now as about their past, for all are bound together in creating the individual's identity. Testimonies written or transmitted orally have become an even more important source of information as fewer and fewer survivors remain with us. For this lecture, I'll be focusing on the testimonies found in the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. And just to say a few words of introduction for those who are unfamiliar with the archive, it's an archive of over 55,000 video testimonies of survivors and witnesses of genocide. Initially, it was a repository of Holocaust testimony, but it has now expanded to include survivor and witness testimony from other genocidal events. For my particular project, there are 1,160 testimonies from individuals who experienced the DP camps in Italy. All but 5 are Jewish survivors. The others are aid workers. 400 of these are women, 750 are men, roughly half of whom were born in Poland. About a quarter of these testimonies are from individuals who were under 18, so children or youth in the DP camps. The majority of the interviews range between 1 hour and 6 hours. It's quite a large gap, but that's how it was broken down. And they were conducted between the mid-'80s and the early 2000s. They're in 13 languages, but the vast, vast majority of them are in English or Hebrew. And so I consulted testimonies in English, Italian, and Yiddish. Today, because of time constraints, we'll be looking at these 3 main areas of change: food, material goods, work and camp life, anger and gratitude. The issue of not having enough material goods, food, clothing, blankets, etc., was widespread throughout post-war Europe. But in the early years after the war, it hit the DP camps particularly hard. In the early months of their formation and formalization, camps often ran out of food and lacked seasonally appropriate clothing, leading to many problems, including illnesses and death. Hirschblank, a DP residing in the Bari transit camp, was distraught enough to try to draw international attention to their plight. He wrote to the Jewish Daily Forward in New York, saying, quote, the nourishment which we receive is not sufficient, and we cannot stand it much longer. I have to add, we are emaciated from those past years, speaking of the Holocaust. There are, of course, quite a few people who have relatives to support them, but the majority is starving. It is impossible to stand it any longer. The newspaper declined to publish Blanc's letter, but it did reach out to the JDC, the international organization, requesting that they look into the complaint. The JDC Europe office wrote to the Italian branch saying, quote, of course we know that the people down in Bari aren't starving, and on the other hand, we understand that due to cuts in the budget and reduction of supplies available, it is not possible for you to do as much for these people as the JDC would like you to do. On the other hand, however, there may be some particular reason for this complaint, and we would like for you to have you look into it and to send us a report. The JDC thus reported that the main issue was a reduction in the rations allotted DPs by the IRO, and that had taken place a month before. But general resentment was really still at being dependent upon others. And it was not just individuals who wrote advocating for better food and supplies in the immediate post-war period. DPs had their own local representatives who would write to organizing bodies on their behalf. For instance, a 1947 letter signed the Cremona camp population. Refugees called on IRO and JDC to re-examine their rations policies, arguing that this new ration scale compels all the camp population without regard to age to a standard of vegetation living and permanent hunger, end quote. Claiming hunger, armed refugees and youth gangs stole rations, spreading panic and public disturbances. Yet, despite the nearly unanimous agreement among the camp residents that neither the IRO nor the JDC were properly addressing all their basic survival needs, the JDC regional chief in Milan wrote to the main European office in Paris that, quote, "We certainly agree that the situation of the DPs in the Cremona camp might be better, but we can assure you that it is not so bad, and certainly not any worse than any other camp in Italy." Hardly words of reassurance for those enduring these not wholly satisfactory living conditions. In their later reflections on the DP camps, however, former refugees and aid workers often describe a different relationship to food. They remember there being enough food in the DP camps, definitely more food than they had had during the war. For instance, Roland Mann, a former social worker in the southern camps, remembers receiving some complaints about food and other issues, but that there weren't too many of these and that they weren't too bad. Her reports from 1945 to 1947, which we have, however, often a more mixed report, far more complaints than she remembers from some camps and very few from others. These later testimonies are often far less fixated on the more material issues of food. How did you eat? Was a common question from interviewers in the VHA. And responses were often, so-and-so organization helped us. We had enough food not to be hungry. It wasn't always the best, but it was enough. And instead, they focus on what food represented to them. In his discussion of his time in the DP camps for his Shoah Foundation testimony, Baruch Goldstein reflects on how deeply concerning the idea of hunger was for the refugees. Quote, "I was still worried about food. Is there enough food available? I was still hungry psychologically, although they provided us with enough food in these camps that I had been experiencing until now. But my first question was, how do people get enough food there?" The Russian-born Goldstein lived through 4 ghettos, 6 concentration camps, and a forced death march before arriving in the Italian DP camps in his mid-20s. He remembers having enough food in Italy, certainly more food than he had had in the concentration camps, but still being concerned about it being there the next day. And let's listen to him talk about this.
3 years in Italy were, as I said, a recovery. Physical recovery was the easiest one. I was young, I was active, I was moving fast, and
Can you turn it up?
I wanted to dance. I did all I could. Even as much as I in the beginning I was mentally disoriented, not even trusting myself, not wanting, being afraid to do anything. Yes, time went on, I became a bit more daring. Loneliness was I felt in those 3 years, it was the worst thing for me. Of course, I learned the pain of hunger, and whenever I have a chance to tell young people particularly, is that hunger is a common experience. We're all hungry once in a while, but the fact that you know there's a refrigerator full of food, or if you have $1 in your pocket, you can buy a cup of coffee, and now you have to have $2 with a donut, but still it's available. So the hunger is maybe painful, hunger is painful, but when you know that after you eat a slice of bread, you're still hungry, and the hunger continues on and on for days, for months, and years. Then you become obsessed with food to an incredible point. You know what my dream was? My dream was that if I survive, I will buy, for my first thing, I'll buy a whole loaf of bread. Just to hold in my hand a whole loaf. Because for so long I only got a slice. And I will start eating from the beginning and finish it up to the end. That would be my first satisfaction. And if I will have potatoes, then what else do I need? Potatoes are a delicacy in most years.
I apologize for the quietness. It doesn't get any louder. The other testimony should be a bit louder. The focus in this and many other later memories is of food in the DP camps as a method of physical and psychological healing. But next to food, complaints of boredom or inability to work rank most high among the concerns of the DPs in the immediate post-war. They write, "Above all, refugees are not permitted to work. Although there are many among us who are capable persons, who could easily make a living being in possession of sound professional knowledge. We are not permitted to work because there is not sufficient occupation for Italy's own population. However, we do know that actually not all DPs were forbidden to work. Many actually worked for UNRWA, IRO, or the JDC, and others were trained by ORT, the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training, which created courses designed to give refugees vocational training in everything from cabinet making to dentistry to, as you can see here, shoes. By 1950, there were nearly 60 ORT training centers operational within the DP camps. And we also know that from the beginning, there had been a plan for cultural rebirth in the Italian DP camps. Jewish refugees themselves created schools and theater groups, produced newspapers and radio shows, and engaged in religious services and cultural activities. And for some, work and cultural activities made all the difference in their stay, especially when we look at their later memories, as Miriam Moskovitz explains.
In the meantime, while we were waiting, there were also all formed cultural groups. There was forming a library, which we didn't have books for so many years. We formed a library. They formed a dramatic group that a friend of mine suggested one day that I should go to a rehearsal. That day, I went to a rehearsal to the dramatic group, and I met my future husband. He was the director of the Jewish theater. He formed a group, a dramatic group. He was born in Białystok, and his father was a director from the Jewish theater in Białystok. And from the memory, he knew all plays from the memory. And he dictated another friend to write down all the plays. And he took children like me, like 10 others, and taught them how to play and directed them. And he wrote a lot of plays from the war. He wrote a lot of plays. One of them, the first one, was De Wecher. And he directed it. And we became acquainted. And automatically we fell in love. And I joined the group, and I played with my husband on the stage. We went from one displaced person camp to the other, entertaining displaced person, people like us. We entertained them.
Cultural activities like this dramatic group gave Miriam Moskovitz a husband and a sense of purpose within the camps. She could work and lift up the spirits of others. But in the moment, oftentimes feelings of resentment grew. Quote, "Do not forget, 3 years have passed after the termination of the war," a letter came out. "People hope to be liberated from the camps, hope to join their family, hope to start again a normal life. It looks as if nothing much has changed, except that today we are free and not threatened with death. We have spent so many years in camps until this very day that it is high time we should get our share of normal life." End quote. Life in any camp then was seen by many as unbearable. More recent testimonies, however, often focus less on the camp part of life and instead point out how temporary it was and how their life was reborn within that very site. So here we'll hear from Gertrude Gotz.
For the first time I experienced freedom. For the first time I saw the ocean and the thrill of being free and going down to the ocean, and I felt a new life was starting,
Gotz was in a southern camp in Santa Maria di Bagni for 3 years. But theories of collective memory may help us understand this shift. The notions of collective memory or narrative are tricky concepts, particularly in a project centered on Holocaust testimony. Leaning on the works of memory scholars like Maurice Halbach or Paul Ricoeur, one can define collective memory or narrative as a desire to tell one's story in such a way that it connects the person with a group. be it a social, religious, or political group. Yael Zerubbabel argues that the making of a new group identity, like the identity of the survivor or the DP, in itself depends on collective memory. And in thinking about Holocaust testimony, Annette Vivorka offers a compelling reason to understand testimonies as participating in collective memory. She writes, "In principle, testimonies demonstrate that every individual, every life, every experience of the Holocaust is irreducibly unique. But they demonstrate this uniqueness using the language of the time in which they are delivered, and in response to questions and expectations motivated by political and ideological concerns. Survivors interviewed years after the war often find themselves charged with conforming to a national or socially accepted version of events surrounding the particular aspects of their experience. Upon closer inspection of these testimonies, one often sees the interviewee attempting to balance their individual experience in the camps, ghettos, hiding, etc., with the now well-known version of the events. Although DP camps remain largely on the periphery of Holocaust testimony and Holocaust studies, we can see the influence of collective narrative in viewing this period as a time of rebirth and new life. And this was especially true for the youth. It was a liminal space, a time after destruction, but at the beginning of something new. A final area of change was in the questions of blame, vengeance, and gratitude. One can find in many immediate post-war testimonies a great emphasis on blaming Germans. Take, for instance, the diary of a young Italian-Polish boy, Leo Berman, living in Cinecittà in Rome, DP camps after the war. The pages of his diary are full of stories from his own time in hiding and from other people's concentration camp experiences, alongside the more mundane concerns about how he would get through school the next day. But throughout, one can feel the palpable sense of anger he expresses. Quote, "That which I am writing, if it comes out one day, will be a warning for those who do not want to believe. This is a simple story of one of the many who had been in a concentration camps for 5 years, tortured by those ferocious beasts, the SS. Calling those monsters ferocious beasts is not enough. Those monstrous murderers must all die." End quote. And he argues that his anger should never end. Quote, "Should there be another war against Germany, I will be the first to volunteer, and I won't feel pity for anyone, just as they have done. After all I have seen and heard, my hatred for this damned people will never cease." One can hardly blame Berman for these passionate sentences. He is very young. The wounds are still very fresh, and he feels he is still living amongst those who had wronged them, saying, quote, "The thing that made me most angry was that some of the lesser murderers are even here in this very camp." And we know from later records that some Nazis and Nazi collaborators did escape Europe and prosecution by going through the DP camps. So perhaps we would even say his anger is not misplaced. Later testimonies, too, also express anger. Many, of course, are still angry about the concentration camps and the persecution that they faced at the hands of the Nazis. However, for many, the most lasting hurt seems to have been the persecution and anti-Semitism shown by their own neighbors during and even after the war. These survivors recall the pain of returning to their cities of birth and being rejected from their home. Miriam Moskowitz, who found her husband in the DP camps, states that they wanted to go to Palestine rather than home to their birthplace in Poland, and here's why.
Poor stateloos, people without a country, because we were so against Poland. We were so bitter of the treatments that they did, what they did to us, and the collaboration that they did with the Germans, that we hated them on the same level as the Germans, even more.
A stateless person, she rejected her birthplace. But even with this anger, many have placed themselves within a particular scheme of collective memory that argued for peace over revenge. But one surprising discovery I made while watching VHA testimonies these past weeks from those who had been in Italian DP camps was the abundance of gratitude these survivors had for Italy and the Italian people. Apart from those Jews who had been sheltered and hidden during the war by Italians, one finds very little mention of Italy and or her people in the pages of writings done in the immediate post-war period by DPs. Complaints, requests, gratitude were primarily made to and against American and British officials and organizations. But in later testimonies, a great many survivors describe the wonder of their time and their stay in Italy. For Sonia Shek, who lived both in a DP camp and then later lived outside of camp, it was the Italian people who made all the difference in her stay.
Were unbelievable. They were so generous and so helpful and had so much love for us. They really had a feeling what we went through. I don't know if because of Mussolini or whatever, but they were absolutely unbelievable people.
And testimonies like this fit nicely with the collective narrative of the Italiani brava gente, or the notion that Italians are inherently good people. This myth has existed since the time of Italian colonization. According to Angelo Del Bocco and Paolo Ferrero, the myth has been used to effectively whitewash Italy's crime, racism, and xenophobia during its imperialist era. Post-war leaders later repurposed the Bravo Italiano to stand against the Cattivi Tedeschi, or the bad Germans, claiming that they too were victims in this war against Nazis. Mussolini and fascism were an aberration. Anti-Semitism and war crimes were thus linked to the, quote, parenthetical regime of fascism, and Italians could claim again to be brava gente. And while it makes sense that Italians would be attempting to remake their own image, repurposing myths and so on, and many, many did rescue and were not anti-Semitic, it is very interesting to see former DPs joining this collective memory narrative. Some DPs, like Sonia Shek, had more frequent and direct contacts with local Italians during their stay in Italy, as she talks about. But many had much less immediate contact with locals. As you remember, it's mostly American and British officials who are running these camps, not Italians. And yet, these DPs still feel grateful to Italians for their perceived care and compassion. Miriam Moskovitz, who we saw earlier, for instance, stated when asked by an interviewer, "How did the Italians treat you compared to, say, the Poles?" Moskovitz, "Very good. Very, very good. When I learned the language, I told them that I am Ebreo. It means Jewish. They couldn't understand the difference." Anti-Semitism, she felt, had not existed in Italy because Italians didn't differentiate between Jews and non-Jews. Italy was safe. Italy was where they learned to be human again. And these shifts in memory show us what is important to the survivor in different time periods and how this changes. Initially, there was a great need to voice complaints to secure a better present and a better future. They displayed great annoyance, resentment, and stress at their liminal situation, but 50 or 60 years later, the focus is less on material needs and more on abstract notions of healing, rebirth, and gratitude. Thinking about the way these more abstract notions appear primary to survivors today, the final section of this talk will turn to a discussion of memorials, the use of physical space in remembrance. And we'll look very briefly at 3 examples of memorialization of the DP camps in Italy today, as we think about the ways in which personal narratives can become collective and put on display for a larger audience, and why this might even be desired today. The DP camp number 34 in Santa Maria di Bagno was the largest and most active of the camps in southern Italy. From 1943 until July 1947, it housed several thousand Jewish refugees, peaking at 2,300 inhabitants in 1946. Located in the heel of the boot, the very bottom of Italy, the town of Santa Maria di Bagno is a mixture of a fishing village and a summer colony, with boats and villas dotting its shoreline. These villas, normally the summer homes of wealthier Italians, were requisitioned by the Allied forces and turned into housing for the DPs. Thus, Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe suddenly found themselves living by the sea in huge, albeit empty, homes. The camp in Santa Maria di Bagno was a popular location for those attempting to make Aliyah, or immigration to Palestine, as it was near the transit camp at Bari and near a port. But many refugees ended up spending 12 to 18 months or more here before being able to move on to their next destination. In that time, many activities were created in the camps, which were sponsored largely by the JDC. Home to 260 children from ages 10 to 18, there were 2 schools established in the camp, especially for youth. Adult classes, primarily language instruction, was supplemented by career training, especially in tailoring and electrical engineering. Theater groups and sports clubs were also very popular. The theater troupe toured. Miriam Moskowitz is actually part of that theater group that toured to other DP camps. And there was a local soccer team that held matches against other DP camps and other Italians. One of the most important memorials to the Jewish DPs in Italy can be found today in Santa Maria di Bagni, a work by a young Romanian Zionist DP living there in the mid-1940s, named Zvi Miller. Miller wanted to make Aliyah more than anything, but was forced because of the British blockade and quota to remain longer in Europe. During his time in the DP camp, he spent a large portion of it painting. The results of this painting were 3 very large murals that covered the walls of a small house several meters from the sea. This first mural, as you can see here, depicts a young woman with 2 children attempting to enter Palestine, but being blocked by a British soldier. The second mural shows a map of Italy and Palestine. There is a barbed wire all along the edge of Italy, and thus as a symbol for the rest of Europe, and an arrow pointing to southern Italy, from where a bridge is drawn to the promised land of Palestine. The final mural illustrates 2 Palestinian Jewish soldiers standing guard to a menorah inside a Star of David. The moral of the story was clear here. British soldiers may have command now, but eventually Jewish refugees will prevail. While in the camp, Miller also met a young Italian woman named Julia, who ran away from home and converted to Judaism to marry him. Together, they made Aliyah eventually, leaving the triptych behind. Years later, a local historian, Paolo Piscane, who was himself cared for by a Jewish DP from the camp as a child, remembered the murals from his childhood and set about to find them and ultimately to preserve them. He founded the Association Pro Murales Ebraici, that's wrong, or the Association for Jewish Murals, in 2004. They reached out to the Israeli ambassador in Italy seeking protection for the murals. And in 2009, the Museum of Memory and Welcome was opened, and the murals were installed inside. It has a permanent exhibition that documents daily life in the camp through photos, documentaries, and artifacts gifted to the museum, often by former DPs. The museum works to both preserve the stories of the past and to educate local Italians about the history of the camps. Today, the museum is visited primarily by school groups for educational workshops and former DPs and their families. For a great many DPs, this camp was where their new life began, where they started or restarted families, and they want to show their rebirth place to their descendants. And as we saw earlier, a profound sense of gratitude toward Italy makes this a near pilgrimage site for many. The museum in Santa Maria di Bagni is an active museum site, but our next 2 remembrance spaces today remain only as the ruins of former camps. Marc Auger wrote, quote, "Ruins exist through the gaze that rests on them. But among their multiple pasts and their lost functionality, what they allow to be perceived is a kind of time outside of history, to which the individual who contemplates them is as sensitive as if they helped him to understand the duration that runs through him." Perhaps the most famous of the Italian Haksharot, or the kibbutzim outside of Israel, the ruins of Salvino and the memory that they hold remain incredibly important to the group of survivors who made their way through its doors. In June 1945, while looking for a location for a new home for the purpose of housing Jewish youth on their way to Palestine, former Jewish brigade leaders, now working for the Jewish Agency, visited a home in the small town of Salvino, which is located roughly 70 kilometers from Milan. Within this small town in the foothills of the Alps, between Milan and Switzerland, there was a large 4-story house, which you can see here, which consisted of a huge dining hall, a generous kitchen, several dormitories, classrooms, an infirmary, an indoor pool, and a home theater, all amidst large gardens and a small forest. During the 20 years of Mussolini's reign, the home was used as a boarding school for elite fascist youth where soldiers on leave could vacation and watch parades and drills of young fascist recruits. And a list of fascist donors remains engraved on the entryway wall, with Mussolini's contribution of 5,000 lira prominently at the top. In the fall of 1945, new leaders opened the doors of Salvino, transporting their young charges with them up the mountain. This young group was primarily made up of children who had been hidden in Italy during the war, but they were soon joined by survivors from concentration camps and from the East Soviet territories. Housing an average of 300 children under 18 at a time, over 3 years, Salvino became home to nearly 800 children, all orphans or unaccompanied minors. Although concrete statistics are unavailable, given the sometimes extremely transitory nature of stays for some of the children, it's estimated that at least 75% of those who passed through Salvino went on to Israel by the time the house closed in 1948. A magical palace and not a dream. Palace on top of the mountain, glorious and grand, because they were from Inferno and Sleet, to this house full of light with a swimming pool and a fancy cinema hall and an elegant dining room, azure beds, white sheets, in showers with white porcelain tiles, garden and green grove and white snow. God, are we not dreaming? But the magical palace now sits decaying. Weeds grow from its roof. Glass from shattered windows covers the rocky ground, and graffiti marks the presence of local gangs, and the absence of any authority. For 50 years, Salvino served as a home for youth, a boarding school, an orphanage, and then later it was a holiday camp for working class youth. But since 1983, it has been abandoned. But its memory is most dear to the nearly 800 Jewish child survivors of the Holocaust, the Bambini di Salvino, or the children of Salvino, who lived in its walls. At a 1983 reunion, the group, which is still active today in Israel, unveiled a plaque that declared in part, quote, "Here in Salvino, they found the joy of youth they had been denied, and the faith in mankind." It's this renewed faith in humanity that many of the Salvino children want to memorialize and commemorate. And they feel it should be done in this space that brought them back to life, especially as the building structure is still there and it's vacant. The group is currently in discussions with the local municipality over the logistics of turning the home into a museum, with the stated goal of remembering the thankfulness of the help of Italians. But for now, the doors remain locked. Oh, and that's the outside of it today. The ruins of the Cremona DP camp also appear to be working to help those who have forgotten it remember its significance. Situated about an hour southeast of Milan, Cremona was home to a Jewish community until the early decades of the 1600s, when after many repeated expulsion attempts, the final Jewish families left the city. Since then, a few Jewish families have taken up residence in Cremona, but their numbers remain very small. Today, Cremona is known primarily for its violin-making heritage, but between 1945 and 1948, this town of roughly 64,000 people housed up to 4,000 foreign Jewish refugees. The DP Camp 82, Cremona, was one of the largest in northern Italy. It was made up of 3 connected monasteries, San Benedetto, Corpus Domini, and Santa Chiara, which were called the Parco dei Monasteri. These monasteries, reconverted into military barracks when under Habsburg control, were located in the middle of the historic old town. The Jewish refugees living here, like in camps across Italy, were originally from a variety of European countries, but the majority were from Poland, and thus the local Cremona population often simply called the Jewish DPs I Polak, or the Poles in the Cremonese dialect. The population of the Cremona camp was often transitory, as it was established very close to an illegal transit point border crossing across the Austrian border. And despite some overcrowding, Cremona was later touted as one of the most successful vocational schools in Italy. The camp closed in 1948, and all the remaining refugees were moved further south. But today, the Cremonese have largely forgotten the history of the Jewish DPs who once lived in their midst. But there is a small group of people, historians, architects, librarians, and survivors, who are trying to remind them. One problem with remembrance today in Cremona is that many local people who would have been alive then don't remember the Jews, or the fact that the monasteries were even a camp. The archivists believe this is because the post-war was a really difficult period for this town, and because the DPs spoke good enough Italian that it was really difficult to identify them. But an architect named Angelo Garioni, president of the group Cremona as It Was, is spearheading the effort to bring back the memory of the camp, specifically by bringing back former DPs like Sidney Zoltak from the beginning of our talk, and by salvaging the ruins of this campsite. 2 of the 3 monasteries remain today unoccupied, and as you can see, falling apart. But there are still traces of its former Jewish inhabitants, seen here
on the walls. Apologies. That one. So we have a menorah here, Mickey Mouse or Topolino. Gariani writes that in the post-war, the camp, quote, had a great symbolic significance in the rebirth of the region. We hope that in the future we can build a memorial to the camp that will be a witness to this beautiful time to posterity. We greatly need it. And in the light of the continued presence of refugee camps across Italy, it appears that this campsite is once again becoming a monument to the possibility of welcome and rebirth in the region. A local Christian aid society, Caritas Cremonese, hosts a center for welcoming refugees and asylum seekers in the area, and a group of African asylum seekers through Caritas Cremonese have recently begun volunteering to clean the Parco dei Monasteri, this old campsite. These migrants, having found at least temporary shelter in Cremona, are working to help preserve the memory of help given to former refugees. And here we can see two more signs of former Jewish life that is still up today. A barbershop and a school signs. Survivor narratives written in the years immediately following the war often look very different than those recorded 30 to 60 years later. These early narratives prioritize their then current situation and express a desire for change. They often discuss the hardships and trauma they faced during the war and their current dissatisfaction with their position in the DP camps. These writings most frequently express the discontentment the DPs felt with the help they were receiving, centered around food and material goods, and with the lack of permanency in their situation. They were highly mobile but felt stuck, without a real say over their future homes, in location or timeline. But in speaking about an upcoming DP camp closure in 1947, a former social worker wrote, quote, "It was during this period that people realized how attached they had become to their homes. Even though these are only small rooms, the thought of moving once more was not a pleasant one." And this attachment to their, quote, homes can be recognized in the shifts in memories we see in later testimonies. Gone is the zeroed-in focus on food scarcity, lack of work, and the desire for vengeance. And instead, we more often see narratives of rehabilitation, rebirth, and gratitude. The hardships of the DP camps, of course, have not been forgotten. But rather, there's a different story to tell now. And for many, that story deserves to be told and commemorated within the space in which it once occurred. But the memory of these places, much like the memory of refugees and displaced persons in Italy, is fading, as those in control of the buildings allow them to die, just as the survivors they housed, are also leaving this earth. The struggle to preserve these old buildings is reminiscent in many ways of the struggle to preserve the lives and the culture of the Jewish refugees who once lived inside them. Thank you.
So we're going to open the floor now for your questions.
Do you want to take them? Should I take them? Yes.
You mentioned that it wasn't until the 1980s that in the 1980s we began to see a lot more survivor testimony. What was it that catalyzed that sort of cultural movement?
That's a good question. Many things. One thing is that survivors are starting to get older. So they're starting to recognize mortality. We also see more openness within culture. It depends on where we're talking about. For the Shoah Foundation, the real impetus is in the 1990s after Schindler's List. So we start to see this even in the 70s with the Fortunoff Archive, a little bit more in the 80s, and then a big boom in the 90s. Does that help?
And obviously the Shoah Foundation was Spielberg's thing. It sort of, and the impetus was Schindler's List. So was that really sort of a big part of it? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. In the 90s, it was definitely a big part of it. And then in the 80s, it's other historians and interviewers who are interested, psychologists who are interested in trying to find out more, trying to get testimonies recorded.
Okay.
If that helps.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As a child who was born in an Italian DP camp, I really appreciate your interest in this topic. It's a very important part of my life. I was born in Florence in January 1946.
Ooh.
And to two soul survivors who had done the Bricha from Poland.
Okay.
Anyway, I've been, in addition to having a very detailed story from my parents, which will become part of a memoir that's soon to be published.
Wonderful.
I have been working very hard to try to find some kind of an archive or registry where my parents' names or my name appears, and have so far been frustrated only.
Yes.
And you know, because my parents, they gave me some names, but they didn't pan out, and we were in a number of them, which is another point. There was movement. I'm one of twins, so there were times, obviously there were some movements related to that, and also because they had specializations. Anyway,
depending on the camp.
I
Right.
don't want to take up any more time. I could tell you a lot more, but
I would love
anyway, I would like to know what suggestions you might have, and it may mean that we need to email or something, or maybe there's some things others would be interested in knowing as far as how to research.
Absolutely. I will give you a short answer, and then we can definitely chat later. I would love to hear more about your story and your parents' story. It's very important. I should also say my work also looks at memoirs. Today was just testimonies, oral testimonies, I should say.
I want to say one thing about the Shoah Foundation and other. I don't know if most researchers realize that is a very selective group that's willing to go before a microphone. My parents would never in a million years. They were way too damaged.
Yes.
And so were many, many other people. So you have a very skewed corpus of information.
Very fair.
And that should be recognized, and has not been in much of the research I have.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. And yes, many people were not and are not, and
it's not
that's absolutely fine.
It doesn't reflect the whole population at all.
No. And I do try to make clear that it is just this group of people who are willing to talk or willing to write and able. Yes. But to your question of tracing resources, I would say two spaces. If you are ever in New York, the Center for Jewish History there has some good tracing resources. If you are ever in Washington, D.C., the International Tracing Service archive is there at the museum. If you are not in those spaces, you can write to them. The International Tracing Service is
I've certainly worked with them.
Great. Nothing there.
Zero.
All right.
And even considered Bad Arolsen a visit there, but I'm not being encouraged.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to do much more than that.
Evo?
It's digitized, but it's not searchable. So it would take.
I'll email with you, Esther.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have thank you very much for the talk. I have a technical question. So, when the Allies kind of run the DP camps, who was actually, how did Jewish organizations acquire the Hashara camps? Did they rent them? Did they buy them? Did the Allies give them permission to do this?
So it kind of depends on which ones they are. So like Salvino, which is a specific Hashara, was actually in the hands of the Italian socialists, who then gifted it to the local Italian Jewish group in Milan, who then gave it to the Jewish Agency. So that's a very specific one. Some of them kind of came about that way. Some of them were requisitioned by the Allies. They just took them and then handed them over either to the JDC or the Jewish Agency to run. Some of them the JDC funded and rented the area. Yes?
I'm going to make a comment. So if there are any students that have questions, I would ask them to say their questions before my comment. Do any of you want to take, as students, do any of you want to take the opportunity to jump in? Because that can be wordy.
For the most part, what was keeping them there? Because you did read that one quote about how they wanted to return to their families, but...
Yes, I think he doesn't mean to return home to their families. So I think the idea was they wanted to return to a family life.
Okay.
So they were certainly able, and if they wanted to repatriate, they were given help. So UNRWA or the IRO would very willingly repatriate anyone who wanted to be repatriated. The majority of Jewish refugees did not want to be repatriated. Some had gone home before coming here, coming to Italy, but almost all of them wanted to move forward. They were stuck because of quotas.
I see.
So to get into the U.S., there was a quota, Palestine quota. To get anywhere, there was a quota, and you had to get an affidavit.
And then it was by, you said 1949, most of them had left. And at that
Yeah.
point, did a lot of people just sort of settle for repatriation, or were they able to?
At that point, so by 1949, almost anyone who wanted to go on to Israel was able to.
Okay.
There were some exceptional cases of people who were too ill to move, but who still wanted to, but were not accepted. So the people who were left were still mostly older or not wanting to go to Palestine and Israel, and wanting to go elsewhere, and just hadn't gotten an affidavit number yet.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
My parents were not in Italy, but I imagine that the experience was somewhat similar. My mom's last camp was Dachau, so her DP camp was in Munich, close by. I agree with this lady that not everybody was a person who spoke. My father's last camp was Buchenwald, and he did not speak frequently. He spoke infrequently, but occasionally about Buchenwald, but not about his DP camp. So they were adults. Their memories are adult memories, and memories were told to me as a child because I was not protected from their memories. And way before the memories had time to fade, way before the show of testimony began. My mother was freed at 31 kilos. And I imagine that there were others that came in at the same sort of weight. She was freed with typhus and one additional disease. During her time in the DP camp, she slowly came back up to normal weight, so she remembers that pretty fondly to be able to be like a lean but normal weight. She doesn't remember it with resentment. She remembers it as, and also many people who survived, intellectuals, were killed off frequently in the early years of the war. And this was the case in many of the camps. Many of the people who survived were working class people who could do hard labor every day and make it through. So, and these were years far before birth control. Many people before their families had been killed off had come from extraordinarily large families who were all killed off. And when you come from a large working class family, you also begin to work at a very early age, typically. So strangely enough, these DP camps held memories of being the very first time in your entire life that you were doing labor, either labor in the actual camps or labor in the ghetto, or working as a working class child in an overly large, what used to be an overly large family. So she remembers it as once she got back to normal weight, and she remembers it as a time of a strange idleness that she never experienced before. And as far as this notion nowadays that you see people that are refugees, but they have cell phones, they know what's going on in the world, and people know to shop for different nations that offer different things. Nobody knew how to shop, and once she got back.
Maybe picking up on this, so who's doing these local studies? That's interesting. Are these kind of academic or local people? And then, since there is not so much on Italy, but there is a lot on or more, not a lot, but more on Germany, where do you see, kind of from your knowledge now, looking into Italy more in depth, where you see differences and similarities regarding these camps.
Excellent. So the people who are doing the histories are a mix. So we have several new studies from academics, from scholars. So the study on Grugliasco. This study on Cremona was started by an architect and local archivists and librarians, but they got a roundtable panel of historians, primarily historians, to contribute to figuring out what happened in Cremona. In the south, we have a new study by a man who actually is a medievalist, but he found documents and he lives in that region and thought, I will look at this and see what is going on here in this new region. He has a whole website. It's actually really, really interesting. Then there are also local. So some of the Salvino children have written histories or memoirs, kind of the quasi in between. As to the differences or the similarities, so there's a lot of similarities, I think. In these camps, you see a lot of marriages, you see a lot of births, you see a lot of reconnecting or connecting for the first time. You see, you have similar problems of food shortage, material shortage, lack of work, or excitement over lack of work, depending on what time, how long that extended, cultural activities, etc. But some of the differences, I think, that we see, so people came to Italy thinking we're going to, for the most part, not all of them, but a lot of them came thinking we are going to Palestine and we are going to get out of here very quickly. There was a fairly common knowledge that the Bricca could get you here and then get you out. The getting out part didn't really happen for a while, but so there's a lot more of a Zionist influence, I think, that's a lot more pervasive. I think that's probably one of the bigger differences that I've seen thus far.
Did you also, because there's new research on DP camps and honor courts in the DP camps, did you encounter something like this in Italy?
There are honor courts. I actually just had someone send me a message asking about a particular honor court case in Rome. And I'm not sure where the papers are. I think they might be at YIVO, but I actually, it's not something that I was looking at or looking for, so I kind of moved over it. But the issue of trying former perpetrators or collaborators within the camps comes up in testimonies, but I haven't actually found the documents yet. So I'm fairly confident they exist, and that I think someone at Yad Vashem is working on them, or Israel somewhere.
Any other questions?
I mean, I have a lot, but if I may.
Yes.
So you mentioned just in passing revenge as a topic. So, I mean, that's a very interesting topic. I think there's more interest in this now. So what can you say from the testimonies? Is this kind of more a common thread? Is this very kind of extraordinary that somebody talks about this? And is there even acting about this, or is this just kind of more thoughts?
What I saw in the testimonies here is comments about, so there's one I'm thinking of in particular where a gentleman is talking about his arrival at the camp and talking about the first beating, and that people would shout greetings when they found their sister, when they found their friend, and they would also shout condemnations when they found a former capo, and there would be a beating. These are kind of said, if they're said at all, kind of in passing, this happened, I don't really want to dwell on it. The passage that I read is from a fairly unique diary, if we can say that. I guess all diaries are probably unique. And he's very explicit in his desire for revenge. There's an interesting call in a literary journal that gets put out saying that the rebirth of Jewish culture is an act of vengeance. So in the time period, that's kind of the documents that I've seen, not a ton of explicit calls for revenge or acts, but kind of in passing memories in the testimonies later.
Well, thank you very much, Danielle, and
Thank you.
thank you everyone for coming.